think about this as purpose being deposits of goodwill in the bank. If you have no credibility and if you have no deposits and something goes wrong, people are going to assume the worst. If you've got a great track record and you've been plodding along and making these deposits of goodwill the whole time, chances are people are going to give you the benefit of the doubt.
Today we are talking with Denise Roberson. She is the Chief Purpose Officer at TBWA Chiat/Day Worldwide and a marketing professor for Presidents and Key Execs MBA at Pepperdine. Welcome to the show, Denise. It's so nice to have you.
Thank you. It's so great to be here. Thanks.
Today we are here to talk about purpose. You have studied purpose from almost every conceivable angle, and I think it's probably interesting to go in kind of a chronological space. So maybe we're going to start with the birth of purpose, and I know this goes way back beyond where you're going to start, but maybe if you could just walk us through when and how this came to be important to branding.
So I think it's an interesting notion that gets brought up quite a bit. And the truth is, in my mind, and again, I love that you brought to the table the fact that this is really an obsession for me. It's something I've studied academically. It's something I've taught. It's something that I do out in the wild in the marketplace and that I'm able to do with the UN and all these different various facets. So when I come at things, there's usually the researcher in me that likes to kind of dig in. And that became a hot topic of debate. Like, when did this happen? And the truth is, we can trace some of the origins back to the 1800s. His name was George Marsh, and he wrote Man and Nature. And he was postulating this notion that civilizations are creating ecological disasters. And it sort of led into the Industrial Revolution and how things sort of played out towards and through those. And I think it's really fascinating because when people say this is trend, this is fad, this is new, it's not. It's taken on some different language and it's taken on some different meanings. But to me, this is absolutely not new. When we talk about purpose proper or sustainability proper, and we'll get into the difference between those things a little bit later, I really think when we saw an explosion of this on a global stage were the 1990s. And we've got some really fascinating things that happened in the 90s that started to be sort of this genesis of what was to come for our current day version of purpose. So the epicenter we could look at is communication. We look at things of how people were actually communicating. And within these large organizations, relatively difficult for people to share their experiences, particularly in other countries, particularly in silos. Here comes, just as a great example, our friends at Nike. They rolled out in like the 1970s. In the 80s, they had a big explosion. So what did they do? They offshored their labor. Why did they do that? Probably to skirt some labor laws and to reduce costs. But the problem with all of that is that they didn't do it ethically. And they found themselves on the front page of the New York Times, and they were really blasted for using child labor for 15 cents that should have been paid 50, abhorrent lack of labor laws of any kind, no standards, no safety. And now all of a sudden, we've got all these stakeholder groups communicating, and the secret's out. That prompted Nike to sort of look at this first in a reactive stance. What do we legally have to do to clean up this mess? And then from a proactive stance, okay, this disaster happened. How can we use this to actually be a better company? How can we increase the materials we're using, increase our working conditions, and actually be a leader on the forefront, as opposed to finding ourselves with this, reputational damage that's catastrophic?
Yeah.
So I think if we start looking at the convergence of what that looks like, the UN in 1992, they had their big summit meeting, and that was the Earth Summit. That's where a lot of things came to the table, and we had these global leaders that passed environmental actions, and it was Agenda 21 that sort of galvanized on a global stage the necessity to do some of these things. Now, at this point, people were looking heavily at the environment, but if you look at anything with the environment, it affects people. So those two are always going to be sort of intrinsically locked together. That led into our internet boom, and now we've got stakeholders communicating readily. And you can't keep those dirty little secrets any longer. So now we've got a vested interest to be able to look at this as opposed from a reactionary regulatory standpoint to a proactive stance of how can we be a better company? What can we do for the world and all these stakeholders? But I really believe that transition, when we look at it through the lens of brand, was brands going from singularly creating their brand in a funnel, in an echo chamber of one, to now brands can only be co-created across the entire stakeholder group. Citizen journalists, customers, but we also have NGOs. We have so many stakeholders that now define what a brand is, that they no longer have control over their own brand definition. So I think that also kind of sped up the process a bit as to why we might want to more heavily consider what these stakeholder groups think of us.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And then as we look at some of the other examples, I would love to hear you talk about Mall, because a lot of the next iteration from my perspective was purpose was really thriving in the nonprofit organizations. It hadn't really migrated over into the for-profit model at the time that Mall was formed. Do I have that right?
I think we were starting to see bits and pieces of what people were calling impact marketing. And I think they were very campaign driven. I think they were very much one-offs. I think we had another silo called corporate responsibility. I think we had all these bits and pieces sort of floating around. Some of the greats had already figured out that they could drill this in to the strategic center of their organization. Media Arts Lab is the division of Omnicom and TBWA that exclusively works with Apple. And there were some brilliant folks that did just stand out, insane work. One of them being Lee Clow, who is now the chairman emeritus. He was hand in hand with Steve Jobs, and they basically built the Apple brand. Everything you see from 1984 forward that, I don't think it's almost every word on the planet of, what an example of epic advertising looks like. But as he sort of meandered towards the end of his career, he was someone that loved the ocean and loved nature and realized, oh man, my legacy is going to be being the Apple guy. I want more than that. Media Arts Lab allowed him to create what was in essence an experiment. And he created, and it was a pun on words, MAL, Media Arts Lab, for good. So MAL for good, even though that means bad for good. Everyone kind of thought it was kind of kitschy. They started taking the principles of big advertising. Think of these as, the Apple players, some of the most creative people on the planet, and applying them towards some nonprofits, some for-profit, but for-profit for good, and really looking at how do we use these skill sets to build something standout. And I think one of the huge things that they did is they created a campaign called Nature is Speaking. They used some of the biggest actors in the world, Harrison Ford, Julia Roberts, Lupita Nyong'o. I mean, the list goes on and on. And they had them personify bits and pieces of nature. So the ocean, Mother Earth, bees, all these incredible things. And they made some of the most spectacular films that were very attention grabbing. And they swept at Cannes, they won, Gold Lion, and everyone all of a sudden was like, well, wait a minute, this is getting interesting now. Because now this isn't just some, tiny little nonprofit that nobody's heard of.
Is it fair to say that that was a model at that point that wasn't fully realized? And then that maybe is a transition to how your role was created at TBWA?
I think so. So if you've got these really high-end creatives, they also usually come with high production costs and huge expenses that most nonprofits simply can't afford. We're able to write off pro bono work and do a lot of things, but there really was an interest in making this a sustainable model. And in order for this to be a sustainable model, we really needed to be able to work with the for-profits and some of the Fortune 5 and some of our multinationals that were on the roster. And they weren't sure quite how to bridge that gap. So that was sort of the interesting task at hand, something I had been doing and also doing doctoral work around, and I had been teaching. And I came across a couple of the senior leaders and they said, hey, we're looking to do this and we think you're doing that. So we went through a series of negotiations and decided, let's try it. I think the world is ready right now. Little did we know the pandemic was a mere couple months behind us.
And how has that impacted your role, do you think?
Oh, it was dramatic because the whole world went into a tailspin. Like nobody had a rule book for what we were going through. These businesses in particular had no idea how to care for their customers, their employees, all of these various groups that prior to this hadn't had such urgency. So they had a crisis on every corner. Two things happened. People that had purpose sort of milling about in the back of their minds, it became urgent. People found themselves in crisis. And that was the other reason of we've either stepped in it unintentionally, we've mismanaged or misthought our way through this, and we need help. So I would say it went from a concept to kind of building the plane as we were flying it.
I really love how you talk about how brands are either part of the problem or part of the solution, that there's no middle ground here. If you speak to that a little bit, and then how that connects all the dots, because I do think this is a pretty confusing space with a lot of labels.
Technology is the great equalizer here. How fast we can communicate globally with the push of a button, I think was really sort of the genesis moment of how this all started to be. So I think for a long stretch of time, brands could simply be quiet. They didn't speak if they didn't want to engage in the conversation, and they ducked down. This notion of, I don't feel like I need to say anything, and that way we'll stay safe. And for a while they did. But unfortunately, we had a couple things come together, technology being one of them. That's sort of the accelerant in all of this. So ease of communication. Then we had a global disaster. That was sort of number two, where we've got now raw emotions. We've got people that are leaning more heavily into their values, people desperately just trying to hold on to any kind of normalcy. Then we had some financial issues. I mean, we had crisis after crisis after crisis. All of a sudden, we find ourselves in this sort of new territory. And I think that was really what took us over the edge and really sort of formalize this notion of what we're calling purpose today. I think it's a great place to look at, but purpose can be proactive and it can be reactive. So I think one of the things is I always tell my customers, think about this as purpose being deposits of goodwill in the bank. If you have no credibility and if you have no deposits and something goes wrong, people are going to assume the worst. If you've got a great track record and you've been plodding along and making these deposits of goodwill the whole time, chances are people are going to give you the benefit of the doubt. Silence is now a loud statement. If you don't say anything, you're saying something very loud. And so now we're sort of caught in these paradoxical situations where brands who have perhaps an older leadership style, people at the helm that haven't been in a position where saying nothing was saying something loudly, it's very scary. I am a firm believer that do you have to engage and do you have to take a wild stance? No. You have to have a purpose, though, and that should be your guiding light. You're allowed to say our organization isn't entirely geared to address this problem, but here are all the wonderful things we are addressing. And I think what I see every day, whether it be in boardrooms, whether it be in conference rooms, whether it be in classrooms, people are using words very interchangeably and not necessarily communicating the same things. So I try and level set with every meeting. If we're using the word purpose, what does that mean? If we're using words like ESG or sustainability, what does that mean? So we're all sort of creating this common language, because I think oftentimes we can get ourselves in trouble because someone's saying exactly what they mean, but they've switched the words out and that person has interpreted those words to mean something else. So we've got this cauldron of, confusion and misconception, which can really lead to this communication breakdown.
When it comes to brands saying something and taking a stance, how important is authenticity to that?
It's everything. Honestly, I think we've got some terrible case studies, unfortunately, of brands that have gotten it really wrong because they rushed that decision and felt some sort of compulsion to make a statement or to roll out a campaign without actually having those difficult conversations with themselves first. When you have those difficult conversations internally and ask the hard questions, if this goes sideways, are we still going to support this cause? Are we strong enough to stand up and take the heat? Those basic questions will keep not only you, but whatever you're standing up for safe. It's better to take a, halfway of an evolutionary step that you're going to stand behind and actually be there for, than to take a full evolutionary step and then tuck tail and run the second people start getting heated, and throwing rotten fruit at you, which is going to happen every time. You can't please everybody. And if you are, it's probably too dilute.
The Dylan Bud Light example is probably an interesting one to think about, where there was some silo activity happening there and they definitely ducktailed and ran.
It was a tragic situation, honestly. Here's a marginalized group that all of a sudden is put on the side of a can and sort of held up as something worthy. And I think so many people in that community were so excited to be represented and accounted for. And because they didn't have the difficult conversations internally, of course there's going to be some backlash. And when other stakeholder groups started shooting up cans and doing all kinds of just outrageous things, the company hadn't already thought through, how are we going to deal with this? They started firing marketing team members and, sort of taking the easy way out. But what happened was it tarnished a bit of their company, and it really blackened the eye of the poor community they were standing up for. So it was like catastrophe. I think we saw that with Kendall Jenner and Pepsi, VW and Dieselgate. Like, we've seen so many moments in time where that can backfire and destroy a company. But even worse, it destroys the stakeholders that you're standing up for that are most likely marginalized to begin with.
What you're saying is it takes time to develop purpose. So what are some of the processes that a brand has to go through, and how long does that take to find the right tension?
Starting small, getting the genesis idea of what it is that you believe your purpose is, workshopping it, making sure it's getting to the far-reaching corners of your company, really having those open, candid dialogues, and please create feedback loops. If someone doesn't feel empowered to give feedback, whether there's a difference in job title, perceived power, whatever that is, you're not going to get honest feedback. So you've got to create that space of honesty and vulnerability and give them different vehicles for feedback. So I think once you've sort of road tested it internally, then you've got to formalize it. And that's focus groups internally. That's talking to external stakeholders to make sure that everything you're doing sort of aligns, and really looking at the genesis of why the company exists and how we can use it for good, for people, for the planet, for our communities, but anchor it to the company. Then it's really taking it external. That's building all of your beautiful, external messages and campaigns, measuring all those things. Then if you're really, really lucky, and I think this is a very small group of people that get to this, or organizations that get to this, it becomes a global business movement. So that's sort of the end state. That's our Patagonias of the world, our Unilevers. They're lucky enough to have made something that's become a global movement.
Do it inside first, really build it from the inside out, because that is the mistake I think a lot of companies make, is they want to jump on this purpose bandwagon and then they put out a press release and they haven't socialized it or figured it out on the inside. So maybe it would be interesting to hear you talk about the gap that I know you've spoken about before.
McKinsey did this great study, and I think that it illuminates one of the greatest problems. I think it was 80% is the quote, of vice presidents and above find their purpose at work. They genuinely believe they are living their purpose. Sadly, 80% of mid-level managers to frontline workers feel like they're getting no purpose at all. So somehow, no matter how authentic, no matter how much time or resources is being put in, there's this purpose gap that it's not getting out to the actual workers that are touching your customers, that are engaging in the work itself. That is a huge watch out. And one, again, I don't see it as much in smaller companies because you can usually get to the people and you know them by name. But when we're talking about these massive multinationals, it can be very, very daunting. I had someone comment on another podcast that I had done, and they said, well, why in the world would you ever need something called a Chief Purpose Officer? Isn't purpose supposed to be everyone's job? Yes, it should be everyone's job, but who owns it? Just like the CFO is owning the financial health of an organization, a Chief Purpose or Chief Impact or Chief Sustainability Officer is owning that particular discipline. They're the steward of it, making sure that it's getting where it needs to be. It's interesting that people just assume that's everybody. Yes, it should be. But you also need someone managing it and caring for it and fostering it.
Talk about the profile of one of your students and why they're coming to you and what they're getting out of it.
I would say that particular program, they're an interesting demographic because they're seeking some kind of change, whether it be evolving from a C-suite position to a board, whether it means stepping down and creating a nonprofit. There's this impetus of change that they're really trying to search and find. And most of them have heard of purpose. And most of them, though, are rather scared because they're like, I know what it is, I believe in it, but I have no idea how to turn this into an actionable strategy and putting tools behind it. So I'm not the person for the job. And so walking them through that, because marketing in their mind, purpose wasn't part of the plan. That wasn't supposed to be part of the syllabus. Mm-hmm. So it's a surprise. And then by the time they get through their time with me, oh my goodness, there are so many pathways, so many new ideas, so many incredible ways that their curiosity and their creativity is starting to merge with this notion of purpose, that it's an incredible thing to see.
What do you look for when you're looking for a job or an occupation if you want to keep purpose at the center of your career?
Passion and values alignment. If you start looking for the sexy companies with the great names and you're not looking at their culture and you're not looking at their values, you've got half of the equation. And you may be unpleasantly surprised that the other half might not be at all what you are looking for to be showing up as your whole self, having autonomy in your day. Some of these really important things that we're searching for don't usually come in brand value. That's, the mark. That's the beautiful branding that goes behind everything. But if you start looking at the culture of it, how are things getting done? What does this company believe in? Not only what do they believe in, but what are they standing up for and supporting? One of the great companies that I work with, their global CMO says there's a difference between what we stand for and what we stand up for. It's easy to say, we believe in equal rights. Show me. What have you been doing to support that?
Yeah. Talk a little bit about how you actuate the business case for purpose and how you measure when it's going well.
It's something that I do on a daily basis. Our hope is always to get it to be a strategic operating unit. If we can bake it into the company, the center of the company's strategy, it's almost like digital. So if we look at digital 10 years ago, everyone was, how do we get it? How do we do it? And now it's just part of the DNA of how everybody does business. The hope is that purpose has a similar trajectory. What is this company built on? What are the company's values? What does it stand for? I would say to anyone wondering why they should do this, go ahead and try and hire an employee in 10 years if you don't have any of these things in place, because values alignment's number one. You can't pay someone enough long-term for them to stay at your organization if you don't have that sort of connectivity to your purpose, to your ESG strategy, and an executional style where everyone can see it and feel it.
As your generation, what are you guys looking for when you're thinking about who you want to join?
Personally, I do think work culture is like a big one related to our topic of saturation. Like, we feel that we're so, I guess, overwhelmed in many facets, and we're worried about how that will carry into the workforce.
I would definitely agree with that. I think having a healthy culture around you, people that support you and really stand firm in what they believe and what they are willing to put out there, that's kind of really the most important thing to me. That authenticity of being able to say, like, this is who I am, and I'm not afraid to say it. I think that goes back to really just how you also treat one another in the workplace. Like, are you seeing your coworkers? Are you hearing them? Are you hearing the company itself? Are you hearing your customers? Because if you're not getting that feedback from the people you're actually serving, then your organization, are you really fulfilling your mission?
Also, specifically from the advertising point of view, like a big pushback that people will give you if you talk about going into advertising, it's like, oh, so you just like sell stuff to people and take advantage of consumers. And I mean, I would love to say that, oh, I worked on this ad and it's like doing something. It's making a difference to some sort of community or doing something good. I think that's a huge appeal.
I think that's how I got into purpose as an occupation, was that exact thought right there. I got to the point where I was like, I'm so sad to have this giant megaphone and everyone thinks I wear the black hat. You know, I want to do this for good. Why do I have this? And I can't use it for something good. And I had a fabulous professor who said, then do something about it. And I thought, the challenge has been thrown down. This is incredible. Think about the P&Gs of the world, and Black is Beautiful, and the Unilevers of the world with Ben and Jerry's and Dove. We do have brands that are doing incredible things, and those are all coming from their agency. And I think right now we're on the precipice of your generation actually expecting that.
Prior, you were kind of talking about how this generation's different, and how, and also how you feel like we need to learn how to have open conversations and not be so divisive.
Unfortunately, Carolyn, we're sort of doomed. We've reached a saturation point where people are living on the two extremes, and this notion of having just a great conversation, empathy, hearing about somebody else's experience and being curious about it as opposed to off-put by it. I mean, daily we are losing ground there. And unfortunately, we're ending up on these two polar extremes, but not the younger generations. I feel like they're the ones that have the capacity to, if we empower them, ask the right questions, have that curiosity, and have these demands. I mean, I have seen younger generation employee groups come together and move mountains because it just was no longer acceptable. That wasn't going to be their work environment. That wasn't going to be what they were going to stand for. And they were able to make incredible change. This is a passionate group of individuals that are able to work collectively.
For sure. I just think our expectations are higher, and that's not a bad thing. Like, because that's the pushback that you often hear. It's like, well, you just need to just get to work and not complain. And it's like, well, maybe some things are worth complaining about.
I definitely think that also comes with, you mentioned the rise of technology. I think that our generation, like, I believe it's like the first generation that's being raised on technology. Everything is so much more visible now. And so when you see what's going on and you're seeing that, like, oh, I'm not happy with this, now you don't just feel it, like you also are given a voice to say, like, I'm upset about this. And it's taking a stance on a platform.
Mm-hmm.
I agree. You guys have power that I couldn't have dreamt of at your age. And I think it's so cool that you guys are being bold enough to use it in those sorts of ways. I think when your generation actually, I think you were talking about, like, be quiet, get to work, and just, push the boulder up the hill. Well, if you don't have that inkling in your gut, this is wrong. This is not the right way. This is not the best way. If you don't have that to begin with, you're just going to keep pushing that boulder up the hill. Mm-hmm. So I think having that sort of genesis thought, that idea of there's got to be a better way, and then coming together, because you do have this powerful ability with technology to gather, to actually share your voice. When you bring those two things together and you galvanize, I think that's when extraordinary change can happen.
Yeah, I agree. Kat raised something, and I'm curious, Denise, to hear what, we're at Thanksgiving and somebody's talking to Kat about what she's doing and what she's studying, and she says advertising, and she gets that kind of like reaction of, you're just a capitalist. You're just, you're not doing anything good. What's a good comeback for that? I mean, because you live and work in this space.
Yeah, I literally work for the largest holding company on planet Earth in advertising, and a lot has been said about that. And it's very odd to have the job position that I do juxtaposed to some of the preconceived ideas. But my comeback to that is always, well, guess who has the biggest megaphone? We do. And if we can start using this more and more for good, we're going to make meaningful change in the world.
Dove, I interviewed their CMO a while ago, and he said that he realized a long time ago they have to stop acting like general managers of brand and think more like an NGO.
I think one of the most powerful things we can do is tap into our stakeholder groups. Get out on the fringe, talk to people. I sit on a lot of boards, and it never ceases to amaze me who's alienated from the conversation. And they're the most needed, the most marginalized, the most fill in the blank, or communities we're serving. Have you talked to these people? Have you literally sat down and had conversations? And so oftentimes the answer is no. So I think that's one of the most valuable things we can do is enter into these conversations, make them safe places, empower people to have real conversations about their point of view, because if not, we're guessing, and that's not a good place to be.
When you say stakeholders, who do you mean?
It's going to come back to that kind of anecdote I was talking about. Before a brand was singularly created in a sort of echo chamber of their own voice. Well, now because of connectivity, we've got investors, employees, we've got customers, we've got NGOs, we've got nonprofits, we've got citizen journalists and journalists in the media. I mean, we've got communities, we've got marginalized groups, we've got groups in totality that are super users, all the way down to people that will never use your product, but have big voices. You don't have control of anything any longer. You have control of what you push out one way, but you do not have control of how that's interpreted or defined. You really have to be open-minded. And that's why I say have the conversations first. Don't assume you know what this particular group is feeling or thinking or even needs. Talk to them.
The theme that these guys came up with that we are recruiting around is this idea of saturated. How do you think that is impacting the purpose, like the pathway of purpose or the future of purpose? Do you think there's a saturation and a purpose fatigue happening, I guess?
I would say where we're running into some problems is the compassion fatigue. We're getting bombarded so often and so many times in a day with all these crises that I think people are going a little numb. And that's the hard part. And that's why I feel like corporations have such a powerful role in all of this, because trust is at an all-time low. And if we look at who still has a little bit of trust, it's the corporations, oddly enough, which 10 years ago was exactly the opposite. But since they have it, they can control what's in their universe, what's in their sphere. They can control what's happening with their fill in the blank, 100,000 employees. And if they do a good job at helping them feel like their work is meaningful and valuable and touching lives, what a great way to refuel people as opposed to exhausting people.
Would you say when it comes to purpose that less is more?
I think in the beginning, absolutely. Get your tiny little grains of sand, put them together, make them as strong as you can, really own them. As you're evolving and as you're progressing and as this is taking root, and we're talking, probably years 4, 5, 6, and the entire company has embraced this, you have the CEO's support, more is more. Then we go pedal to the metal and we really start trying to use our voice as a massive megaphone and do more good in this world.
But is there still a case for there to be like a mix of I guess for consumers, do they want to see these really purpose-driven campaigns and the funny ones, or does it need to be embedded in all of it?
It depends on the brand itself. I think you've always got to be cognizant of your consumer. Who is your consumer? What do they need? I think if you're defining purpose as, extremely emotional and heartfelt, I would not suggest beating somebody over the head constantly. I think Apple's a wonderful example here. Apple just released a spot and had Octavia Spencer as Mother Nature kicking butt and taking names. Everyone got a great laugh because it was extremely humorous, but very effective in communicating what it was that Apple believes in and what they're trying to tackle right now. So I think your tone is important, but I think it has to be varied for the occasion. If you're constantly hitting one note, you could be in trouble. it depends on the tone and tenor of your brand, what you're trying to convey. I think you've got to show up for the moment with the right message.
It's a really interesting point, though. I mean, I know in advertising in general, humor was always the hardest sell. But I think what's interesting, and I like what you're saying, Denise, is, I think right now we all hear purpose and we do think of this like heartstrings single note, but purpose can have a sense of humor, right? Like that's probably the fertile ground that I could see people exploring.
Yeah, and I think purpose can use scare tactics, and purpose can use all types of tonality to convey the urgency of what you're trying to communicate. I mean, right now, what the really great people are doing in the industry is they're trying to work with that tone. They're trying to make sure it's not being pigeonholed into soft and fluffy. Mm-hmm. And they're trying to look at range right now and appropriateness of what's needed for this moment. What do we need for this? Do we need to cut through with humor? Do we need it scared? What do we need in this moment? And I think the more steady and the more foundational your purpose is, the more materials you have to work with creatively.
One thing that I do like to ask everybody that we interview, Denise, is how would you define beautiful thinking?
I think beautiful thinking is what we need to evolve our way out of the mess we've created for ourselves. And I think it's the thinkers that are able to break down walls and instead of looking at conflict as disastrous or off-putting, embrace it and look at it for all the rich, extraordinary detail and information it can provide. And I think it allows for a lot of empathy. Our world is missing and lacking empathy. So a beautiful thinker to me is someone who can think empathetically and to really use this time to kind of create our new narrative and our new tomorrow.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode. This episode was created and produced at the IU Media School as part of the Beautiful Thinkers podcast, IU Edition. To follow along this season, check out The Beautiful Thinkers on Instagram and TikTok. Special thanks to Natalie Ingalls for our music and the students who researched and recorded this episode, Kat DeSantis and Michaela Bruns.